A billionaire CEO steps into a homeless shelter and sees a face he never expected to encounter, his ex-wife holding a newborn baby. What unfolds next is a story of heartbreak, redemption, and second chances. Welcome to the True Crime Studio, where every tale reveals the unexpected. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that will leave you speechless.
Robert Smith adjusted his cufflinks, their platinum edges catching the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. The skyline of Manhattan stretched endlessly before him, a testament to his empire and relentless ambition. Every building seemed to bow to his influence, his name engraved in the very steel that held the city together. At 42, Robert was the epitome of success, a billionaire with an empire spanning technology, finance, and philanthropy. Yet, amidst the luxury and power, there was an emptiness he never allowed himself to fully examine. He glanced at his watch, a custom Patek Philippe, as his assistant, Marcus, entered with the day's agenda. The list was as packed as always: a board meeting, a luncheon with investors, and a public relations campaign at a downtown homeless shelter. Robert frowned at the last item. "Do I really need to attend this shelter event?" he asked, more out of habit than genuine resistance. He knew the answer. Marcus nodded. "It'll play well with the press, especially after last week's article questioning the company's social responsibility efforts." Robert sighed. Optics mattered in his world, even if they felt hollow. "Fine. Have the car ready." The day unfolded with its usual precision, every moment accounted for. By the time Robert slid into the back seat of his chauffeured car en route to the shelter, his mind was already elsewhere, calculating projections for a potential merger. He barely noticed the streets shifting from polished to worn, skyscrapers giving way to dilapidated buildings and narrow alleyways. The shelter was a stark contrast to Robert's world of pristine offices and Michelin-starred restaurants. Its facade was unremarkable, its purpose noble yet unglamorous. A small crowd had gathered for the event, cameras clicking as Robert stepped out, his tailored suit an odd fit against the backdrop of peeling paint and weathered faces. Inside, the air was thick with a mix of institutional cleanliness and the faint scent of desperation. Volunteers bustled about, distributing meals and blankets to the shelter's residents. Robert moved through the motions, shaking hands, exchanging polite words, and posing for photos. His expression was carefully neutral, neither overly warm nor detached. And then, amidst the muted chaos, he saw her. Lila. The world seemed to tilt as his gaze locked onto her. She stood near a corner of the room, cradling a baby in her arms. Her once bright auburn hair was now dulled, tied back in a loose braid. She wore a simple cardigan and jeans, a stark departure from the tailored dresses she used to favor. Her face, though older and wearier, still held a quiet strength he remembered all too well. But it was her eyes, those piercing green eyes, that stopped him cold. They were softer now, but with a guardedness that hadn't been there before. Robert froze, his polished veneer cracking as the implications hit him. The baby in her arms couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its tiny fist clutched at her sweater, and she held it with the instinctive protectiveness of a mother. His mind raced, each thought louder than the last. Was this her child? And if so, who was the father? Before he could process further, Lila turned and met his gaze. Her eyes widened in recognition, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a composed indifference. She didn't smile. She didn't approach. She merely nodded, an acknowledgement and nothing more, before turning back to the baby. Robert's feet felt rooted to the floor, his usual confidence replaced by a maelstrom of emotions he hadn't felt in years. Memories of their life together surged unbidden. He remembered their first meeting, her laughter ringing through a sunlit cafe. He remembered the arguments too, her accusing him of being too consumed by his work, of leaving no room for them. And he remembered the final fight, the one that ended it all, her voice breaking as she said she couldn't compete with his ambition. A sharp tug on his sleeve brought him back to the present. Marcus was beside him, his expression concerned. "Mr. Smith, The reporters are waiting. Robert nodded mechanically, allowing himself to be guided away, but his thoughts remained fixed on Lila. The rest of the event passed in a blur. He smiled for the cameras, delivered a rehearsed speech about giving back, and exchanged more handshakes. Yet his mind kept replaying the same image, Lila standing there, holding that baby. Back in the car, Robert sat in silence, the hum of the city outside barely registering. His phone buzzed with notifications, but he ignored them. For the first time in years, the meticulous control he prided himself on felt like an illusion. Later that evening, Robert found himself alone in his penthouse. The sprawling space, with its sleek lines and curated art, felt suffocating. He poured himself a glass of scotch and walked to his desk, where an old photo album sat. He hadn't opened it in years, but tonight he couldn't resist. The pages were filled with snapshots of a life that now felt like a distant dream. There was Lila, laughing at some long-forgotten joke, her head thrown back in unrestrained joy. Another photo showed the two of them on their wedding day, her eyes filled with hope and love. He lingered on that one, his chest tightening. "What happened to us?" he murmured to the empty room. As he closed the album, a single thought consumed him. He needed to know the truth. Why was Lila at the shelter? And who was the baby? For the first time in years, Robert felt something stir deep within him, something more profound than ambition, more urgent than wealth. It was a need for answers, a longing to understand what he had lost and why. Robert barely slept that night. The silence of his penthouse, usually a comforting void, felt oppressive, filled with unspoken questions. The image of Lila holding the baby lingered in his mind, vivid and unrelenting. Who was the child? What had happened to her life after their divorce? He had assumed she'd moved on, found happiness, or at the very least stability. Yet the sight of her at a homeless shelter suggested anything but. He replayed the encounter in his mind 100 times, dissecting every detail. The way her arms instinctively cradled the baby. The way her eyes, once so open and trusting, now seemed veiled. And the baby itself, its tiny fingers, its soft cries. His heart clenched with a feeling he couldn't name. Was it guilt? Regret? Fear? By morning, Robert had convinced himself he needed answers. He told himself it wasn't about the baby, it couldn't be. It was about Lila. He just wanted to ensure she was okay, to understand why she was at the shelter. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The possibility that the child could be his nod at him, a relentless whisper he couldn't ignore. The next day, Robert returned to the shelter. It was a far cry from the carefully curated world of his corporate life. The worn-out chairs, mismatched tables, and peeling paint stood as a testament to resilience, not wealth. Volunteers moved with purpose, their tired smiles masking the weight of their work. And among them, he spotted her. Lila was standing near the back of the room, rocking the baby gently in her arms. She looked different in the daylight, still weary, but calmer, as if the routine of the shelter offered her some semblance of stability. For a moment, Robert hesitated. His polished shoes felt out of place on the scuffed floor, his tailored suit a glaring contrast to the simplicity around him. Memories of their marriage rushed back in vivid detail. He remembered how they used to argue late into the night, their voices echoing in the cavernous spaces of their home. Lila had always been passionate, driven by a desire to make the world better, while he had been consumed by his ambition. Their fights weren't just about their differences, they were battles of principle, of identity. And in the end, those battles had worn them both down. Now, standing just a few feet away, he felt an unfamiliar vulnerability. He wasn't the powerful CEO in this room. He was just a man who had once loved this woman and didn't know how to face her. Lila noticed him before he could decide what to do. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look surprised, only resigned. She adjusted the baby in her arms, her movements slow and deliberate, as if bracing herself. "Robert," she said, her voice steady but devoid of warmth. "What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. I saw you yesterday. I didn't know you volunteered here." She gave him a small, humorless smile. I don't volunteer. I'm here because I need to be. Her words hit him like a blow, confirming what he'd feared. He glanced at the baby, who was now squirming slightly, its tiny hand reaching out toward Lila's necklace. The sight made his throat tighten. Is that your child? He asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Lila's expression hardened, a wall going up between them. Why are you here, Robert? This isn't your world. You don't have to do this. I need to understand, he said, the desperation in his voice surprising even himself. Why didn't you tell me? About the baby? About all of this? Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he thought she might unleash years of pent-up anger. But instead, she took a deep breath and shook her head. You don't get to ask that, she said firmly. You made your choices, Robert. And I made mine. She turned to walk away, the baby nestled against her shoulder. Panic surged through him. He couldn't let her leave, not like this, not without answers. Wait, he said, reaching out but stopping short of touching her. Lila, please. I just want to help. She froze, her shoulders tense. Slowly, she turned back to face him. Her expression was softer now, but her voice was tinged with sadness. Help? She repeated. You've always wanted to fix things, Robert. But some things can't be fixed. Not with money. Not with power. Sometimes they just are. He opened his mouth to respond, but she shook her head, cutting him off. I have to go, she said, her tone final. Take care of yourself. And with that, she walked away, disappearing into a small side room. Robert stood there, the hum of the shelter around him a distant noise. He felt hollow, like he'd been stripped of his defenses and left bare. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Back in his office, he tried to focus on work, burying himself in meetings and reports. But his mind kept drifting back to Lila. The way she looked at him, guarded, distant, yet still carrying a spark of the woman he once knew. And the baby? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw its tiny hand reaching for her necklace. By the time evening rolled around, Robert knew he couldn't let it go. He needed to know more, to piece together the puzzle of Lila's life and the baby's identity. Was it his child? The timing seemed possible, but he couldn't be sure. The uncertainty was unbearable. He found himself scrolling through his phone, his contacts filled with private investigators and fixers. It would be easy to dig into Lila's life, to uncover everything she'd been through since their divorce. But something held him back. Lila had always valued her independence, her privacy. Snooping felt like a betrayal, even if his intentions were good. Instead, he poured himself another drink and stared out at the city lights. For the first time in years, the power and wealth he'd worked so hard to build felt meaningless. All he could think about was the woman he'd once loved and the child she held in her arms. And so, Robert made a silent vow. He would find out the truth, not through force or manipulation, but by earning her trust. It wouldn't be easy, Lila had made it clear she didn't want him involved. But he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Robert couldn't shake the encounter at the shelter. Days passed, yet every moment felt steeped in questions he couldn't answer. Lila's guarded expression haunted him, and the image of the baby, so small and fragile in her arms, was etched into his mind. He knew she wouldn't willingly give him answers, not after how things had ended between them. But Robert wasn't one to leave things unresolved. If she wouldn't tell him, he'd find out another way. The decision wasn't easy. He told himself it was for the right reasons, to help her, to understand. Yet a small, nagging voice in his mind questioned his motives. Was it really about Lila and the child? Or was it about easing the guilt that had begun to creep into his thoughts, the cracks in the wall he'd spent years building around himself? Sitting at his desk late one evening, Robert stared at his phone. One call was all it would take. He scrolled through his contacts, pausing at the name of an old associate, a private investigator who had worked discreetly for him in the past. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. This felt invasive, even for him. But the alternative, Doing nothing was unbearable. When he finally made the call, his instructions were simple: find out everything about Lila Whitaker's current circumstances. He ended the call abruptly, unable to linger on what it meant to pry into her life. Now, all he could do was wait. The report arrived 3 days later, a thick envelope delivered to his office. Robert dismissed his assistant early, closed the door, and sat down with the document. His hands felt uncharacteristically unsteady as he opened it. The first pages detailed her finances, or lack thereof. She had no stable income, working sporadic part-time jobs as a receptionist and a server. Bank records showed her account balance was often in double digits, just enough to scrape by. She had no permanent address, instead cycling between shelters and short-term housing. There were notes about her health, too, frequent visits to clinics, likely for the baby, though some might have been for herself. Robert leaned back in his chair, the weight of the information pressing down on him. Lila, the woman who once argued with him about donating more of their wealth to charity, was now relying on the very shelter she used to advocate for. It didn't seem real. This was Lila, strong, determined, and proud. How had it come to this? Flipping through the pages, Robert found a section on the baby. There were no definitive answers, only more questions. The investigator had noted the baby's approximate age, 6 months, give or take, and a lack of any records indicating the father's identity. Robert did some quick math in his head, his breath catching as he realized the timing lined up with the end of their marriage. The possibility that the child was his felt both thrilling and terrifying. He closed the folder, staring out at the city lights beyond his window. For years, he justified their divorce as inevitable. They were too different, he told himself. She wanted to save the world, and he wanted to conquer it. But now, faced with the stark reality of her struggles, he began to question everything. Had he been too quick to walk away? Too focused on his own ambition to see what she truly needed? Memories of their final days together came rushing back. Their arguments had grown sharper, their words more cutting. He'd accused her of not supporting his vision, of being too idealistic. She'd fired back that his ambition was a black hole, consuming everything in its path, including her. And then there was that last fight, the one that ended it all. She had accused him of prioritizing his empire over their marriage, and he had accused her of trying to hold him back. The divorce papers were signed within weeks, both of them too stubborn to look back. But now, staring at the folder on his desk, Robert felt a pang of guilt he couldn't ignore. He had walked away, believing they were better off apart. Yet here she was, struggling in ways he couldn't have imagined, and he hadn't even known. The next day, Robert found himself pacing his office. The guilt gnawed at him, a foreign sensation he wasn't used to handling. He had built his life on control, on logic. But this wasn't something he could solve with a merger or a press release. This was personal. Determined to take action, he decided to visit the shelter again, this time without the fanfare of cameras or assistants. When he arrived, he spotted Lila almost immediately. She was sitting at a table, the baby in a carrier beside her. She looked exhausted, yet there was a calm about her, a quiet strength that hadn't dimmed despite her circumstances. For a moment, he hesitated. What could he say that wouldn't come across as intrusive or patronizing? But he couldn't leave without trying. He approached slowly, his footsteps soft against the worn linoleum floor. Lila glanced up, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Robert," she said, her tone cautious. "Why are you here again?" "I needed to see you," he admitted. "I've been thinking about everything." She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Everything?" He nodded, glancing briefly at the baby before meeting her eyes. "Your life. The baby. I know things have been difficult." Her jaw tightened, and he could see the wall going up again. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," he said quickly. I want to help." She shook her head, her voice firm. "Help? You think showing up here and throwing money at the problem will fix anything? That's not how this works, Robert. I'm not trying to throw money. he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was trying to do. Lila, is the baby mine? The words hung in the air, heavier than anything he'd said before. Lila's expression didn't change, but he saw something flicker in her eyes, anger, maybe, or sadness. That's none of your business, she said, her voice icy. You don't get to walk out of my life and then come back demanding answers. I didn't walk out, he said, his frustration slipping through. We both made choices, and mine was to move on. She interrupted. You have your life, Robert. Let me have mine. She stood, gathering the baby's carrier and slinging a worn bag over her shoulder. Robert reached out, but she brushed past him, her movements quick and deliberate. Within moments, she was gone, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the shelter. Robert felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had come here looking for answers, but all he had found were more questions, and a growing sense of how much he had truly lost. Lila adjusted the straps of the baby carrier as she walked briskly through the shelter's modest hallway, her heart pounding from the confrontation. Robert's voice, his questions, and the way he looked at her, all of it left her unsettled. She had worked hard to compartmentalize the past, to lock away the memories of their life together in a box she never intended to reopen. But seeing him now, with all his polished confidence and restless energy, had rattled her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She stepped into the quiet of the shelter's small staff room and set the baby carrier on the table. Mia stirred, her tiny hand reaching up toward Lila's face. A smile softened Lila's features, the tension in her chest loosening slightly as she leaned down to kiss her daughter's cheek. It's okay, baby, she murmured. We're okay. But were they? The question lingered as she sank into a chair, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a rare moment of reflection. After the divorce, Lila had told herself she'd made the right decision. Robert's world had always been too big, too relentless, for her to truly fit into. She had tried, in the beginning. She'd attended the galas, smiled for the cameras, and even defended him during the long hours he spent building his empire. But over time, she realized she wasn't just standing in his shadow, she was disappearing into it. The final fight had been inevitable, though that didn't make it any less painful. She'd accused him of putting his ambition above everything else, of leaving no room for her or the family she had dreamed of building together. His response had been just as cutting, accusing her of not understanding the pressures he faced, of wanting a version of him that didn't exist. The words had been sharp enough to draw blood, but it was the silence that followed that ended them. Lila had walked away with her head high, determined to start over. She'd rejected Robert's financial settlement, accepting only what was legally mandated and refusing the additional offers he had made. Pride, some had called it. Stubbornness, others had said. But for Lila, it was about proving to herself that she could stand on her own. And she had, at least for a while. She found a modest apartment, a steady job, and a semblance of independence. But then came the discovery that changed everything, the 2 pink lines on a test she had taken in the cramped bathroom of her office. She had stared at them for what felt like hours, a wave of emotions crashing over her, fear, joy, disbelief. Mia had been a surprise, but she had also been a lifeline. From the moment Lila heard her daughter's heartbeat during that first ultrasound, she knew she would do whatever it took to give her a good life. Even if that meant struggling more than she ever had before. Pride had kept her from reaching out to Robert. She had told herself it was better this way, that he wouldn't want the disruption or responsibility of a child. And truthfully, she hadn't wanted to open herself up to the rejection she feared would come. Robert had always been good at compartmentalizing, at moving on. She hadn't wanted to find out just how easily he could move on from her, and now their child. Raising Mia alone hadn't been easy. Lila had learned to stretch every dollar, to find joy in small victories, a warm bottle, a night of uninterrupted sleep, the first smile on her daughter's face. She worked odd jobs, taking shifts wherever she could find them, and when her apartment lease ended and the rent skyrocketed, she made the hard decision to rely on shelters. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, but she refused to let Mia feel the weight of her struggles. At the shelter, Lila found a sense of community she hadn't expected. The other mothers, the volunteers, even the staff, they all understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. And as much as Lila gave to the shelter, offering her time and energy when she could, it gave back to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It became a sanctuary, a place where she could let her guard down, even if only for a moment. But Robert's sudden reappearance threatened to unravel everything she had built. The sight of him, still as handsome and commanding as ever, had stirred something she had buried long ago. She hated that part of her still responded to him, that a small flicker of hope had sparked when he'd asked about Mia. But hope was dangerous. Hope could lead to heartbreak. As Mia began to fuss, Lila gently lifted her from the carrier, cradling her close. She hummed softly, rocking her daughter until her cries quieted. "You don't need him," she whispered, as much to herself as to Mia. "We're doing just fine." But even as she said the words, doubts crept in. Was it fair to keep Robert from knowing about Mia? She had convinced herself it was the right choice, but seeing the look on his face today, the genuine confusion, the raw vulnerability, made her question that decision. Lila thought back to the way Robert had looked at Mia, his eyes softening in a way she hadn't seen in years. It was clear he suspected the truth, and she knew him well enough to realize he wouldn't let it go. Robert wasn't the type to walk away from a challenge, and if he believed Mia might be his, he would dig until he found the answers. But what would he do with those answers? Would he try to take Mia from her? Would he try to buy his way into their lives, as he always had? Or, Lila swallowed hard, would he surprise her? Could he be the man she had once believed he was, the man she had fallen in love with? The thought scared her more than anything else. Because if he was, it meant she might have been wrong to walk away. And that was a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled Lila from her thoughts. One of the shelter volunteers poked her head into the room, offering a kind smile. "Everything okay in here?" Lila nodded, adjusting Mia on her shoulder. "Yeah, we're fine. Just needed a quiet moment." The volunteer hesitated, then stepped closer. "That man who was here earlier, he seemed determined." Lila's stomach tightened, but she forced a smile. "He always is." The volunteer studied her for a moment before nodding. "Well, if you ever need to talk, you know where to find me." As the volunteer left, Lila leaned back in the chair, her mind racing. She knew Robert wouldn't stop until he had answers, and part of her hated him for it. But another part, a small, traitorous part, wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was time to let him in. For Mia's sake, if not her own. Still, Lila wasn't ready to make that decision yet. For now, all she could do was protect her daughter and hope she was strong enough to face whatever came next. Robert sat in his car outside the shelter for what felt like an eternity. He'd parked on the street a block away, hoping to gather his thoughts before facing Lila again. The folder with all the information he'd gathered lay on the seat beside him, but he hadn't touched it since receiving it. The truth was, he didn't need to read the details again. He already knew enough. Lila was struggling, and the baby, Mia, might very well be his. It had been days since their last encounter, and he hadn't been able to focus on anything else. Meetings blurred into background noise, and even the most pressing deals seemed insignificant compared to the storm brewing inside him. He knew he couldn't let things remain unresolved. Lila deserved answers just as much as he did, even if either of them liked what those answers might be. As he stepped out of the car, Robert took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as he approached the shelter. The familiar scent of disinfectant and warm food greeted him as he entered, and the steady hum of conversation filled the air. He spotted Lila almost immediately, sitting at one of the tables with Mia in her lap. She was feeding her a bottle, her expression soft but weary. The sight stopped him in his tracks. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. But then Lila looked up, her eyes meeting his, and he saw the flicker of recognition turn into a guarded resolve. She didn't move, didn't try to leave, but the tension in her shoulders told him everything he needed to know. She was bracing herself. Robert crossed the room slowly, his steps measured. When he reached her table, he gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "May I?" he asked quietly. Lila glanced at Mia, then back at him, before giving a reluctant nod. "Go ahead." He sat down, the silence between them heavy and uncomfortable. For a moment, he simply watched Mia, who had finished her bottle and was now looking around with wide, curious eyes. She was so small, so fragile. The realization that she might be his daughter sent a pang through him he hadn't expected. "I need to know," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "Is she mine?" Lila's eyes hardened, and she shifted Mia in her lap as if shielding her. "Why does it matter now, Robert? You've been fine without us. Why can't you just leave it alone?" "Because I can't," he replied, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I can't stop thinking about you, about her. If she's mine, I deserve to know." "And what then?" Lila shot back, her tone sharp. "You swoop in, play the hero, and then what? Go back to your world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals? Mia doesn't need someone who only shows up when it's convenient." Her words cut deep, but Robert refused to back down. "I'm not trying to play the hero. He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I just want to do what's right. For both of you." Lila laughed bitterly. "Right? You think you can just fix this with money or a few heartfelt promises? It's not that simple, Robert. It never was." "I know it's not simple," he said, his voice rising. "But I'm trying, Lila. I'm here, aren't I?" She shook her head, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and Robert began to wonder if she would ever answer him. But then she sighed, her shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's yours." The words hit him like a freight train. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, disbelief, fear, all crashing over him at once. He looked at Mia, who was now babbling softly, her tiny hands reaching for Lila's necklace. His daughter. The realization was overwhelming. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Why did you keep this from me?" Lila's eyes flashed with anger. "Because you didn't want this, Robert. You made that clear when you walked away. You were too busy building your empire to care about anything else. Do you know what it was like, trying to figure out how to raise a child on my own, knowing the father was too consumed by his ambition to even notice?" Her words stung, each one landing with the precision of a well-aimed dagger. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but she wasn't finished. "I didn't want your pity or your money," she continued. "I wanted to prove I could do this on my own, that I didn't need you. And I have, Robert. It hasn't been easy, but Mia and I were okay." He could see the fire in her eyes, the same determination that had drawn him to her in the first place. But he also saw the pain, the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. "I'm sorry," he said softly, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I didn't know. I should have, but I didn't. And I'm sorry." Lila looked at him, her expression softening slightly, though the tension in her posture remained. "I don't want your apologies, Robert. I just want you to understand that this isn't your life anymore. You made your choices, and I've made mine." "I know," he said, his voice steady. "But I want to be part of her life. I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Finally she sighed, her gaze dropping to Mia. "This isn't something you can just decide on a whim," she said. "Being a father, it's not a part-time job. If you're serious about this, you have to prove it. Not to me, but to her." "I will," Robert said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. "I don't know how yet, but I will." Lila nodded slowly, though her expression remained cautious. "We'll see." As she stood to leave, Mia giggled, her tiny hand reaching out toward Robert. He hesitated, then gently extended his finger. Mia grabbed it, her grip surprisingly strong, and Robert felt a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Bye, Robert, Lila said, her tone softer now but still guarded. Bye, Lila, he replied, watching as she walked away. Mia nestled against her shoulder. For the first time in a long time, Robert felt a sense of purpose beyond the confines of his empire. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to walk away this time. Not from Lila, and not from Mia. Robert spent the next few days meticulously planning his next steps. The confrontation with Lila had been raw and emotionally exhausting, but it had given him something he hadn't felt in years: clarity. Mia was his daughter. That fact alone had shifted the axis of his world, giving him a purpose beyond quarterly earnings and shareholder meetings. But knowing the truth was only the first step. The real challenge lay in proving to Lila, and to himself, that he could be the kind of man Mia needed him to be. Lila, meanwhile, found herself torn. Robert's apology had sounded sincere, and the way he had looked at Mia, with something like awe and tenderness, had stirred feelings she wasn't ready to confront. Yet, she couldn't shake the fear that this was temporary, another fleeting interest for a man whose life revolved around power and success. She had seen Robert's intensity before, and while it could be captivating, it often came with a cost. When Robert called her a few days later, asking to meet, she almost said no. But the thought of Mia growing up without knowing her father stopped her. Against her better judgment, she agreed. They met at a small cafe near the shelter, a neutral space where Lila felt less vulnerable. Robert arrived first, dressed in a suit that was too formal for the setting but unmistakably him. When Lila walked in, carrying Mia in a sling, his eyes lit up. She noticed the way he immediately focused on Mia, his expression softening as she cooed and wriggled in her sling. "Thank you for coming," Robert said, standing as she approached the table. Lila nodded, sitting down and adjusting Mia's sling. "What do you want, Robert?" He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I want to help. I know I've been absent, more than absent. I've failed you both. But I want to do better. For Mia. And for you." Lila raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched across her face. "And what does help look like to you? A trust fund? A new apartment?" Robert winced at her tone but pressed on. "I can offer financial support, yes. But it's more than that. I want to give you and Mia a safe, stable place to live. Somewhere you don't have to worry about rent or shelters." Lila shook her head, her defenses rising. "I don't need you to swoop in and fix everything. I've managed this long without you." "I know you have," Robert said earnestly. "And I admire that. But this isn't just about you anymore, Lila. It's about Mia. She deserves a better start than we can give her apart." Lila hesitated, her mind racing. She hated the idea of accepting his help, of giving him the power to disrupt the life she had worked so hard to build. But she couldn't deny the truth in his words. Mia did deserve more. "What's the catch?" she asked, her tone sharp. "No catch," Robert said. "Just let me help. Let me be part of her life." Lila studied him, searching for cracks in his resolve, but all she saw was sincerity. Finally she sighed. "Okay. But I have conditions." "Name them," Robert said immediately. "We stay on our terms," Lila said firmly. "I don't want you thinking you can control us just because you're footing the bill. Mia and I need stability, not interference. And if I see even a hint that this is more about your ego than about her, we're gone. Understood?" "Understood," Robert said, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Lila." The arrangement began tentatively. Robert arranged for a modest apartment in a safe neighborhood, insisting on keeping it close to the shelter so Lila could maintain her routine. He hired a nanny to help when Lila needed to work, though she remained skeptical of anyone else caring for Mia. Robert, true to his word, immersed himself in Mia's life. He visited daily, sometimes staying for hours to play with her or help Lila with household tasks. At first, his presence felt awkward, like an intruder in a world he didn't fully understand. But slowly, as he spent more time with Mia, the walls began to come down. He was surprised by how much he enjoyed the simple moments, feeding Mia her bottle, making silly faces to get her to laugh, or just holding her as she drifted off to sleep. She had a way of grounding him, of making everything else in his life seem less important. For the first time in years, Robert felt something resembling peace. Lila watched these moments with cautious hope. Seeing Robert with Mia reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with, a man who, beneath the ambition and drive, had a deep capacity for love. But she couldn't ignore the shadow of his corporate world, which still loomed large. That shadow became a problem sooner than either of them anticipated. One evening, Robert arrived late to the apartment, his phone glued to his ear as he paced the living room. Lila frowned as she rocked Mia in her arms, listening to the one-sided conversation about contracts and deadlines. When Robert finally hung up, he looked at her apologetically. "Sorry. Long day." "You're always having a long day," Lila said, unable to hide the edge in her voice. "If you're going to be here, be here. Mia doesn't need someone who's only half present." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying, Lila. But this is my life. I can't just walk away from it. And this is our life," Lila shot back. "Mia needs stability, Robert. Not a father who's constantly on his phone or rushing off to another meeting." The tension between them simmered, old wounds threatening to reopen. Robert knew she was right, but balancing the demands of his empire with his new role as a father felt impossible. He wanted to be there for Mia, but the weight of his responsibilities made it hard to let go. "I'll do better," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I promise." Lila nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "We'll see." Despite the challenges, their fragile alliance held. Robert made a concerted effort to be more present, even stepping back from some of his work obligations to spend more time with Mia. Lila, in turn, began to let down her walls, allowing herself to believe, if only a little, that Robert might truly be changing. But the cracks in their partnership were still there, waiting for the right moment to surface. And as much as Lila wanted to believe in Robert, she couldn't shake the fear that his world, the one she had fought so hard to leave, would always pull him away. For now, though, they both chose to focus on Mia, the one thing they could agree on without hesitation. Robert stepped into the apartment, balancing a small bag of groceries and a stuffed animal he'd impulsively picked up for Mia. It had been another chaotic day at the office, but he was determined to push it all aside and focus on his daughter. Over the past few months, he had learned how to compartmentalize, carving out a version of himself he hadn't seen in years, someone capable of being present, even if it didn't come naturally. "Lila?" he called as he stepped inside, setting the groceries on the counter. Silence greeted him, and for a moment, a prickle of unease crept up his spine. It wasn't unusual for Lila to be in the other room, but something about the stillness felt wrong. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled cough, followed by Lila's soothing voice. He followed the sound to Mia's nursery, where he found Lila sitting in the rocking chair, cradling Mia in her arms. The baby's cheeks were flushed, and her little body seemed to shiver despite the blanket wrapped around her. "What's wrong?" Robert asked, his voice laced with concern. "She's burning up," Lila said, not looking up. "I've been trying to bring her fever down, but it's not working. She won't stop coughing." Robert's stomach dropped. He knelt beside them, placing a hand on Mia's forehead. It was alarmingly hot. His pulse quickened as he looked at Lila. "We need to take her to the hospital." Lila hesitated, her worry etched across her face. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to that, but you're right. Let's go." Within minutes, they were in Robert's car, speeding toward the nearest hospital. The tension in the air was palpable, their shared fear uniting them in a way nothing else had. Lila kept whispering reassurances to Mia, though her voice trembled with every word. Robert gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing through every worst-case scenario. At the hospital, the staff moved quickly, whisking Mia into a pediatric exam room. A doctor examined her as Robert and Lila hovered nearby, their worry growing with each passing minute. When the doctor finally turned to them, her expression was serious but calm. "She has a severe respiratory infection," the doctor explained. We're going to start her on antibiotics and monitor her closely. It's good you brought her in when you did. Lila exhaled shakily, relief mingling with lingering anxiety. Robert reached for her hand without thinking, and to his surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she gripped his hand tightly, as if drawing strength from him. Hours passed as they waited by Mia's bedside. Her tiny body looked so fragile against the crisp hospital sheets, her breaths shallow and labored. Lila sat on one side of the bed, Robert on the other. For the first time in years, there was no animosity between them, only a shared determination to be there for their daughter. "This is my fault," Lila said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I'd caught it earlier, maybe she wouldn't be this sick." "Don't do that," Robert said firmly. "This isn't your fault. You're an incredible mother, Lila. Anyone can see that." She looked at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You don't know what it's like, Robert. To feel like you're failing her every day. To wonder if you're enough." Robert leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You are enough. You've been enough for Mia in ways I couldn't be. But I'm here now, and I want to share this with you. You don't have to do it alone anymore." Lila's resolve wavered, and she looked away, wiping at her eyes. Robert sat back, giving her space, but his words lingered in the air. As the night wore on, they took turns holding Mia, soothing her when she stirred. Robert marveled at how natural Lila was, her every movement filled with love and care. He thought about how much he had missed in Mia's life, moments he could never get back, and a pang of regret coursed through him. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, Lila fell asleep in the chair beside the bed. Robert stayed awake, watching Mia's chest rise and fall with each small, labored breath. He realized then how much he had been running, from his emotions, from his responsibilities, and even from himself. His ambition had been a shield, protecting him from vulnerability but also isolating him from the people who mattered most. When the doctor returned later that morning with good news, that Mia was responding well to treatment and could go home soon, relief washed over both Robert and Lila. As they packed up to leave, Robert felt a shift within himself, a quiet determination to put Mia and Lila first, no matter what. Back at the apartment, Lila put Mia down for a nap and joined Robert in the living room. The exhaustion on her face was evident, but so was something else, a hint of gratitude, perhaps. "You were good with her," she said softly, surprising him. Robert looked at her, his expression serious. "I want to be better, Lila. For Mia. And for you." Lila folded her arms, her defenses rising instinctively. "This isn't just about showing up when things get hard, Robert. This is every day, every moment." "I know," he said. "And I want that. I know I've been selfish, and I've let my ambition control me. But I'm ready to change. I can't lose either of you." Her eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, Robert saw a flicker of the warmth they used to share. But there was also hesitation, a fear she couldn't quite hide. "I don't know if I can trust you yet," she admitted. "I want to, but I'm scared, Robert. You hurt me before, and I don't think I can survive that again." Robert nodded, his voice steady. "I understand. And I'm not asking for your trust overnight. But I'll prove it to you. I'll show you that I've changed." Lila studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "We'll see." It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. And for Robert that was enough. Over the next few days, Robert rearranged his schedule to spend more time with Mia and Lila. He delegated responsibilities at work, something he had never done before, and found himself more present than he had been in years. For the first time, his life felt balanced, not perfect, but meaningful. Lila noticed the changes, though she remained cautious. Watching Robert play with Mia or help with bedtime routines stirred feelings she had tried to bury. She could see he was trying, and that effort meant more to her than he could ever know. But the scars of their past still lingered, and she wasn't ready to let her guard down completely. Yet, as she watched Robert tuck Mia into her crib one evening, his expression filled with tenderness, Lila felt a small crack in her armor. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them after all. Robert arrived at the apartment with a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and a folder tucked under his arm. The flowers weren't a grand romantic gesture. They were simple and unassuming, chosen because he remembered how much Lila loved them. It wasn't about rekindling the past, at least, not yet. It was about acknowledging the present, and what they were trying to build together. Inside, the apartment was quiet except for the sound of soft music playing in Mia's room. Lila was sitting on the couch, a mug of tea in her hands. She looked up as Robert walked in, her expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Flowers?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "For you," Robert said, setting them on the counter. "No strings attached." Lila gave him a small smile, though her guard was still up. "What's the folder?" Robert hesitated, then sat down across from her. He set the folder on the coffee table but didn't open it immediately. "It's a proposal," he said carefully. "Not for business. For us." Lila's smile faded, replaced by a wary expression. "Robert, just hear me out," he interrupted gently. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About trust, about showing up, about being here every day. And you're right, I can't change the past. But I want to build something better for the future." Lila sipped her tea, her eyes scanning his face. She didn't respond, so he continued. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "This isn't about forcing us back together. It's about being the best parents we can be for Mia. I've realized that's what matters most, her. And us working together to give her the life she deserves." He opened the folder, sliding it toward her. Inside was a simple agreement, shared custody arrangements, plans for Mia's schooling and care, and a long-term financial commitment to ensure she had everything she needed. But there was something else, too, a detailed proposal for the shelter. Robert had committed to funding a complete renovation, with new programs for families and expanded resources for women like Lila who were working to rebuild their lives. Lila stared at the documents, her eyes widening as she read. "You want to fund the shelter?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I do," Robert said. "Not just for you, but because it's the right thing to do. I've spent so much of my life building an empire, and for what? To watch numbers climb higher? This feels real. Important. And if it helps you and Mia in the process, even better." Lila set the papers down, her hands trembling slightly. "Robert, this is a lot. It's generous, but it's also overwhelming. I don't expect you to decide right now," he said. "Take your time. Think about what's best for you and Mia. I'm not going anywhere." She nodded slowly, her mind racing. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the determination in his voice. He wasn't the same man who had walked out of her life all those years ago. He was still ambitious, still intense, but there was a softness now, a willingness to prioritize something other than his career. Over the next few days, Lila weighed Robert's proposal carefully. She consulted with the shelter's director, who was ecstatic about the potential funding, and spent long nights staring at Mia's sleeping face, wondering what kind of life she wanted to build for her daughter. Finally, she came to a decision. When Robert arrived at the apartment a week later, she met him at the door, holding Mia in her arms. There was a new sense of calm in her demeanor, though her eyes betrayed her nerves. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside, his heart pounding as he followed her to the living room. They sat down, and Lila took a deep breath before speaking. "I've thought a lot about what you said," she began. "And I believe you mean it. I see the changes you're making, and I want to give this a chance, for Mia's sake, and maybe for ours too." Robert's shoulders sagged with relief, but Lila held up a hand to stop him. "But we're taking this slowly," she said firmly. "One step at a time. No rushing, no big gestures. Just day by day." "Day by day," Robert agreed, his voice steady. "And about the shelter?" Lila hesitated, then smiled. "I think it's a good idea. If you're serious about it, I'll help you figure out how to make it work. I am, Robert said. And I want you to be part of every step. Lila nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing. Okay. In the weeks that followed, Robert and Lila began to navigate their new partnership. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments, moments of doubt, and plenty of awkwardness as they learned to co-parent. But there were also moments of connection, shared laughter as Mia took her first unsteady steps, quiet evenings where they reminisced about the past, and small, unspoken gestures that hinted at the possibility of something more. For Robert, the changes were transformative. He found himself stepping back from the relentless grind of his corporate life, delegating responsibilities and prioritizing time with Mia and Lila. The shelter renovation became a passion project, one that allowed him to blend his business acumen with a newfound sense of purpose. For Lila, the journey was more complicated. She struggled to reconcile the man Robert was now with the man she had once loved and lost. But as she watched him with Mia, saw the way he lit up when their daughter smiled, she couldn't deny that he was trying. And slowly, her walls began to come down. One evening, after Mia had fallen asleep, Lila and Robert sat on the couch, sharing a quiet moment over cups of tea. The tension that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by a tentative sense of ease. I never thought we'd get here, Lila admitted, her voice soft. Neither did I, Robert said, a small smile tugging at his lips. But I'm glad we did. Lila glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. Do you think? Maybe we could be more than just co-parents someday. Robert met her gaze, his heart swelling with hope. I'd like that, he said. But only if it's what you want. No pressure. No expectations. Lila smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. We'll see. For now, it was enough. As the evening wore on, they sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of their past no longer as heavy. In the next room, Mia stirred in her crib, letting out a soft, contented sigh. It was a small sound, but it was enough to remind them both of what they were building, a new beginning, shaped by love, trust, and the promise of something better. Life has a way of giving us second chances when we least expect it.
This story reminds us that life often gives us second chances, but it's up to us to embrace them with humility, courage, and love. Robert and Lila's journey shows the power of forgiveness and the strength it takes to rebuild. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more incredible tales from the True Crime Studio. Thank you for watching, and may your days be filled with love, hope, and second chances. See you in the next story.